The cameras were rolling, the studio lights burning bright, and the air crackling with anticipation. The stage was set, and everyone knew what was about to happen. This wasn't just another interview, it was a confrontation. On one side sat J.D. Vance, calm, composed, and ready. On the other was a journalist known for his aggressive questioning, a man who had made a career out of putting public figures on the spot, twisting their words, and cornering them into submission. But tonight would be different. The moment the interview began, it became clear that the journalist wasn't interested in a fair discussion. His tone was smug, his words laced with condescension, as if he had already decided the outcome before the first question was even asked. The audience could sense it. The way he leaned forward, the slight smirk on his face, it was all part of the act. He wasn't there to listen. He was there to attack. "Mr. Vance," the journalist began, flipping through his notes as if he was about to deliver the knockout blow in the first round. "You've been accused of spreading dangerous rhetoric, of fueling division in this country. Do you really believe your views represent the American people? Or are you simply catering to a small, radical fringe?" The words hung in the air, a loaded question designed to box Vance into a corner. The journalist had used this strategy before, frame the conversation in a way that forces the guest to defend themselves before they even have a chance to speak. Most politicians would stumble, offering a weak defense or trying to change the subject. Vance, however, was different. He leaned back slightly, letting the moment linger. The journalist was expecting an immediate response, a rushed attempt to push back. Instead, Vance allowed the silence to stretch just long enough to make the tension in the room palpable. Then, with a slight smile, he finally spoke. "Divisive rhetoric," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Let me ask you something. When working-class Americans say they're struggling, when they point out that the policies coming from Washington are hurting them, do you consider that divisive? Or is it only considered dangerous rhetoric, when it challenges the narrative that people like you want to push?" The journalist blinked, clearly not expecting the counterattack so early. He shifted in his seat, adjusting his papers, trying to regain control of the conversation. "Well, that's not what I'm saying." "But it is," Vance interrupted, his tone unwavering. "Because what you're really asking is whether or not I have the right to speak for the millions of Americans who feel abandoned by their own government. And my answer is simple. Yes, I do. And if you took the time to actually listen to them, instead of dismissing their concerns as radical, you might understand why so many people feel ignored by the very institutions that claim to represent them." The tension in the room escalated. Even the audience, which had been relatively quiet up until this point, seemed to shift in their seats. The journalist had walked into this expecting an easy victory. He had assumed that he could dictate the narrative, control the flow of the conversation. But now, for the first time, it was clear he was not in control. Still, he pressed on, trying to regain his footing. "Mr. Vance, the policies you support on immigration, on the economy, many experts say they're outdated and harmful to progress. How do you respond to that?" Vance chuckled, shaking his head slightly. "Progress for whom? Because from what I've seen, the only people benefiting from these so-called progressive policies are the elites who never have to deal with their consequences. Working Americans don't see progress. They see higher prices, lower wages, and a government more interested in political games than actually solving problems. So tell me, when exactly does this progress you speak of start benefiting the people who actually need it?" The journalist opened his mouth as if to respond, but hesitated. He was being forced into an unfamiliar position, defending policies that outside of Washington were deeply unpopular. This was not how things were supposed to go. Vance leaned forward now, his eyes locked on the journalist. "You see, the real problem here is that people like you don't actually have to live with the consequences of the policies you defend. You don't have to worry about making ends meet. You don't have to worry about crime in your neighborhood. You don't have to worry about whether your kids are getting a decent education. And yet, you sit here and tell the American people that their concerns aren't valid, that their struggles aren't real." The room was silent. The journalist, for all his confidence at the start of the interview, suddenly looked unsure of himself. The cameras were still rolling, but the energy had shifted entirely. For the first time, it was clear. J.D. Vance wasn't there to play along with the game. He was there to expose it. The journalist shifted in his seat, clearly trying to maintain control of the conversation. His confidence had taken a hit, but he wasn't ready to back down just yet. He flipped through his notes, searching for a new angle, a way to trap Vance into saying something that could be twisted and used against him later. The tension in the studio was thick, but Vance remained unshaken, waiting patiently for the next move. "So," the journalist finally said, forcing a chuckle as if to brush off the previous exchange, "you talk about representing working Americans, but many believe your policies are too extreme. Some argue that your stance on immigration, for example, is harsh and lacking compassion. Do you think that kind of rhetoric actually helps bring people together?" It was another carefully crafted question, designed to paint Vance as someone who lacked empathy. A common tactic: turn the conversation away from facts and make it about feelings. But Vance wasn't about to play along. "Compassion?" Vance repeated, tilting his head slightly. "Tell me, where's the compassion for the American families struggling to pay rent because wages haven't kept up with inflation? Where's the compassion for the parents who worry about their kids' safety in neighborhoods where crime is on the rise? Or the small business owners who are barely holding on because the government keeps prioritizing everyone but them?" The journalist opened his mouth, but Vance didn't give him the chance to interject. "You see, that's the problem with these conversations. People like you frame the debate in a way that makes it seem like there are only two options: blindly accept policies that harm American workers or be labeled as cruel. That's not reality. Reality is that every nation has a responsibility to its own citizens first. And if our government refuses to prioritize the well-being of the people who built this country, then who exactly is it serving?" A murmur rippled through the audience. The journalist's smirk had disappeared completely now. He hadn't expected this level of directness, this level of clarity. He had counted on vague answers, the kind of political dodging he was used to from other guests. But Vance wasn't dodging anything. He was meeting every question head-on. The journalist took a breath, trying to regain his footing. "But don't you think that kind of rhetoric creates division?" Vance let out a small laugh, shaking his head. "No, I think ignoring the struggles of millions of Americans creates division. I think pushing narratives that benefit the ruling class while ignoring the pain of working-class citizens creates division. The real divide in this country isn't between races or between rural and urban Americans. It's between the elites who make the rules and the people who have to live with them." Silence. The journalist had nothing to say. The studio, once filled with an air of confidence from the host, was now frozen in disbelief. Vance had turned every argument on its head, exposing the hypocrisy for what it was, and for the first time the journalist had no follow-up. The journalist shifted once again, clearly unsettled by the way the conversation had unfolded. He had walked into this interview with a strategy, expecting J.D. Vance to stumble, to fall into one of the carefully laid traps disguised as tough but fair questions. But nothing was going according to plan. Instead of deflecting or scrambling to appease, Vance was cutting through the nonsense with brutal precision, turning the questions back on the very institutions the journalist was so desperate to protect. Still, the journalist wasn't ready to concede. He leaned forward, adopting a more serious tone, as if to signal that he was about to ask the real question, the one that would finally expose Vance as unreasonable or out of touch. "You talk a lot about the struggles of working Americans, but isn't it true that many of the policies you support, your economic views, for example, would actually harm the very people you claim to represent? The free market works best when it's left alone, doesn't it? Shouldn't government step back and let businesses create the opportunities people need?" It was a classic argument, one that had been used for decades by politicians and media figures alike. Frame the issue in a way that made corporate interests seem inseparable from the well-being of the American worker. But Vance wasn't buying it. He leaned forward slightly, his expression serious. "Let me ask you something. How's that been working out for the average American?" The journalist hesitated, but Vance didn't stop. For decades, we've been told that if we just let the market do its thing, if we let corporations operate without any oversight, if we prioritize Wall Street over Main Street, then everything will work itself out. But here's what actually happened. Manufacturing jobs disappeared. Wages stagnated, small businesses got crushed by multinational giants, and entire communities were left behind. Meanwhile, the people pushing this idea of economic freedom got rich off the destruction. The journalist opened his mouth as if to interject, but Vance wasn't finished. And now, after all that, you sit here and ask me whether we should just keep doing the same thing. You ask me if we should continue trusting the same system that betrayed millions of hard-working Americans? No. The truth is, the only people who still believe in this fantasy of an unchecked free market are the ones who never had to live with the consequences of it. The weight of his words settled over the room. The journalist, usually quick with a rebuttal, seemed momentarily at a loss. He looked down at his notes, flipping through them as if searching for a lifeline. "But isn't that just anti-business rhetoric?" he finally asked, though his confidence had noticeably faded. Vance chuckled. "Not at all. I'm pro-business. I'm just not pro-exploitation. I want American businesses to succeed, but I also want American workers to succeed. And if that means challenging the status quo, then so be it." For the first time, it was clear, the journalist wasn't just losing control of the conversation, he was losing the argument. The journalist exhaled sharply, clearly frustrated. His carefully crafted questions, designed to corner and discredit J.D. Vance, were failing one after another. The typical media tactics, loaded phrases, emotional appeals, and oversimplified narratives weren't working. Vance wasn't just deflecting them, he was dismantling them in real time. Determined to regain control, the journalist changed his approach. He flipped to another topic, hoping to catch Vance off guard. "Let's talk about your stance on cultural issues," he said, his tone shifting to one of barely concealed accusation. "Many critics argue that your views on social policies are outdated, even dangerous. You speak about traditional values, but isn't it true that America is changing? Shouldn't we embrace progress instead of clinging to the past?" It was a familiar talking point, one that had been repeated in countless interviews with conservative figures. The implication was clear. Traditional values were synonymous with backwardness, and progress could only be defined by one particular ideology. Vance, however, was unfazed. "Progress," he repeated, pausing for a moment as if weighing the word carefully. "You say that as if it's always a good thing, but progress toward what?" The journalist blinked, not expecting the question to be turned back on him. "Not all change is good," Vance continued, "and not all traditions are bad. But here's the problem. We've been told for years that if we just throw away everything that came before us, if we reject the values that built this country, then somehow we'll end up in a better place. But look around. Do people seem happier? Are families stronger? Is our society more united? Or have we created a culture where people feel more isolated, more uncertain about their future, and more divided than ever before?" The journalist opened his mouth, but Vance wasn't done. "You call it progress, but all I see is chaos. We've devalued family, stripped meaning from community, and told people that their history and traditions are things to be ashamed of. And now we wonder why so many Americans feel lost. So no, I don't believe in mindless progress just for the sake of it. I believe in preserving the things that actually make life better: family, faith, purpose, and responsibility. If that makes me outdated in your eyes, so be it." The journalist shifted again, visibly uncomfortable. He had expected vague answers, something he could easily twist into a headline. Instead, he was facing an argument that cut through the usual political noise. Desperate to regain control, he tried once more. "But don't you think people should have the freedom to define their own values instead of being told what to believe?" Vance smiled, but it wasn't a smile of amusement. It was the smile of someone who had heard this argument too many times before. "Freedom isn't the absence of values," he said simply. "It's the ability to choose them. But the problem is, when a society abandons all shared values, it doesn't create more freedom. It creates confusion, division, and instability. And that's exactly what we're seeing today." The journalist had nothing left. For the first time, he looked truly defeated. The journalist sat back, his frustration barely concealed. He had tried every tactic, framing J.D. Vance as out of touch, painting his policies as harmful, and attempting to discredit his worldview as outdated. But nothing had worked. Instead, Vance had countered every argument with clarity and conviction, exposing the flaws in the very narratives that the media so often pushed as unquestionable truths. Realizing that his original strategy had failed, the journalist made one last attempt to shift the conversation. If he couldn't win the argument, he could at least try to discredit Vance on a personal level. "You've positioned yourself as an outsider, as someone who speaks for everyday Americans," the journalist said, his voice sharper now. "But let's be honest, you've had your own success. You went to Yale, worked in finance, and now you're in politics. How are you any different from the so-called elites you criticize?" It was a last-ditch effort, a desperate attempt to undermine Vance's credibility by painting him as a hypocrite. But Vance didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his expression calm but firm. "You're right," he said. "I did go to Yale, I did work in finance, and I saw firsthand how disconnected the people making decisions in this country are from the struggles of ordinary Americans. That's exactly why I speak out, because I've seen how the system works, or more accurately, how it doesn't work for the people it's supposed to serve." The journalist opened his mouth, but Vance continued. "You see, the difference between me and the elites I criticize is that I haven't forgotten where I came from. I haven't allowed success to blind me to the reality that millions of Americans face every day. I don't look down on the people who built this country. I stand with them. And that's exactly why conversations like this matter." Silence filled the studio. The journalist, who had walked into this interview expecting to control the narrative, now found himself completely outmatched. He had no more rebuttals, no more traps to set, and the audience watching from home could see it. Vance leaned back, letting the weight of his words settle in. He didn't need to raise his voice or resort to theatrics. The truth was powerful enough on its own. The journalist, realizing he had nowhere left to go, forced a tight smile. "Well, that's certainly one perspective," he said, attempting to wrap up the interview with a neutral tone. But everyone in the room knew the truth. This wasn't just another routine political debate. This was a moment of clarity, a moment where someone had dared to challenge the media's carefully crafted narratives and had emerged unshaken. As the cameras cut away, the journalist quickly shuffled his notes, avoiding eye contact. Vance, on the other hand, remained composed, a small knowing smile playing on his lips. He had done more than just win an argument. He had exposed the truth, and the studio had never been so silent.